in South Carolina. His Facebook profile shows him wearing a jacket emblazoned with two flags. The one on the left, that of apartheid-era South Africa, a flag that was replaced in 1994. The one on the right, that of the unrecognized state of Rhodesia, which was governed by a white minority from 1968 to 1979. Both flags are linked with the white supremacy movement in the U.S. and around the world. Joining me now is Michael German, a fellow with the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice, and Richard Cohen, president of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Richard, let me start with you. Well, actually, Michael, let me start with you. In terms of the flags, I'll let you both weigh in on this. What does that tell you about this young man?
It's what in law enforcement we would call a clue, right? It might be an indication of where he's coming from, what his ideology is. Doesn't necessarily mean anything about the actual act of violence, but certainly it's something that gets factored in the totality of the circumstances to try to understand why this happened.
Richard, I think a lot of people are unfamiliar with the flag of Rhodesia, right? And that the former flag of South Africa is a symbol of white supremacy. Can you drill down a little deeper and give us information about the genesis of this being absorbed or co-opted, if you will, by white supremacists around the world?
You know, I think the flag of Rhodesia is a little unusual to see in white supremacist circles, but the glorification of South Africa is certainly not. It was an era of apartheid there. Many people in the white supremacist movement admire it. And there's been some interchange between white supremacists in South Africa and in this country.
Joy, it would seem that the line that he allegedly uttered as he was gunning down these 9 victims, "You rape our women and you are taking over our country," speaks volumes about what may have motivated this young man.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Southern Poverty Law Center has done tremendous work about the tremendous rise in hate groups in 2 distinct eras in American history. In 1996, the mid-90s with Bill Clinton's election, and when Barack Obama got elected, when the number of hate groups skyrocketed. A lot of this activity does take place online. And you think about a 21-year-old, where would they get this ideology if they're not attending meetings or becoming a part of the white nationalist movement in person? Well, there's a robust dialogue about what people are calling #white genocide that's even in social media. It's easy to find pretty much anywhere. And as SPLC has said, those flags are a part of the symbology of that movement. And if you want to talk about Rhodesia specifically, the current Zimbabwe, I can only tell you just from my family being on the continent that revolution that overthrew Rhodesia and installed a black nationalist government in Zimbabwe also involved removing a lot of white farmers from their land and deporting them. And that in the lore of former white Zimbabweans, there is a lot of that is tied up in exactly the purge, which people see as having been violent, anti-white racism. And that regime, just how Rhodesia was disbanded, is still an object of contention among people who are either white or black Zimbabweans.
Mike, talk to us a little bit about how white supremacist groups function in the United States. One would assume there are certain ones that exist sort of above board and are acknowledged and tracked, but the ones that are promoting violence, I would assume, are underground.
Right, and you got to understand it as a movement. So, certainly both the movement itself sees itself as international. White supremacy wasn't invented in the United States of America, obviously, so they see a kinship with white people everywhere. So that's why these foreign elements are essential to what they're doing. But the criminal element is actually somewhat separate from the above ground groups. So you have above ground groups like the Klan, Aryan Nations, those types of groups. But what I found when we were working those undercover cases was that there was an intentional separation, both because a lot of the groups didn't actually agree with the violence. They thought...
There are some that do disagree with violent tactics.
As a tactic. And often they would talk about it as it's not appropriate at this time or something like that. But even where they did agree that somebody should be doing the violence, they didn't want to be involved in it because there was risk there.
How do they recruit?
They recruit all kinds of ways. I mean, obviously, the internet is a very effective means of communication that we all use, so you can expect anybody's going to use that. But back in the 90s, before the internet was big, we were on mailing lists, so we would get all kinds of mail. They would do leafleting. Once you were in the network, there were phone numbers you could call that would go to answering machines that had messages on them on what to do next, or where to go next, or where the next meeting was. So it was sort of a subculture that existed that in many ways didn't want to be part of the normal culture and just wanted to be separate, but there was definitely a violent criminal element that was engaged in all kinds of different criminal activity.
Richard, when you hear Mike explain the levels of recruitment, I mean, this is an industry. You know, there are tiers, there is organization. Talk to us a little bit about where we are right now, where the landscape is right now in terms of groups mushrooming up in this particular moment and what we've seen in the last 6 to 8 years.
Well, you know, it's interesting. We've seen a real increase in the number of white supremacist groups in the last 15 years, but actually a little falling off in the last couple of years as people have been, you know, kind of leaving organized group and retreating to the anonymity of the net. But the level of violence in the white supremacist movement has not decreased, and the level of overall activity has not. You know, you look at something like Stormfront. It has, which is a neo-Nazi portal, one of the leading hate websites on the net. It has 300,000 registered users and millions of visitors. And that number of registered users has increased by about 60% over the past 5 and 6 years. So, you know, the level of violence, the level of activity is still high, but it's more dispersed and less organized than it has been in prior years.
Richard Cohen, Michael German, and Joy Reid, thank you all for your time.
Thank you.
Coming up, South Carolina Congressman Mark Sanford will discuss how the Charleston community is grappling with tragedy. That is just ahead.